Every day, billions of clicks are powered by a single, intoxicating fantasy that a simple accident could erase the line between a server and a billionaire. But this isn't just a story. It's a psychological blueprint, and its real-world consequences are far darker than the fairy tale suggests. This narrative didn't emerge from a vacuum. It's the engineered product of a century of literature, cinema, and now, algorithmically driven social media, all reforging the same ancient Cinderella story for a modern audience. But to understand its grip, we must rewind to the moment the template was set. The incident that crystallized the entire genre didn't happen at a gala. It happened in a publisher's office in 1966. Edith Wharton, a 34-year-old copywriter from Milwaukee, had spent 3 years writing her manuscript during her lunch breaks. Her story followed Claire, a department store clerk who, after spilling a tray of champagne on a reclusive shipping magnate at a company party, becomes entangled in a world of luxury and danger. The publisher who finally said yes, Lionel Gable of Gable and Stern, didn't buy it because of its literary merit. He bought it for one line in Edith's cover letter. She wrote, "This is a fantasy for women who feel invisible, giving them a backdoor into a world that has locked them out." Gable, a man who understood markets better than literature, recognized a latent demand. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s had created a new American upper class, visible through television and glossy magazines, yet felt increasingly distant to the average middle-class housewife. Social mobility had stalled. The gap between the haves and have-nots was no longer just economic, it was becoming a cultural chasm. Romance novels at the time were dominated by historical fluff or chaste nurse-doctor dramas. Gable saw a chance to weaponize that distance. He gave Edith a $500 advance and a list of demanded revisions. The magnate, originally named Mr. Thorne, became Alexander Blackwood III. His character was stripped of any redeeming qualities except for a mysterious, trauma-induced loneliness. Claire's agency was systematically reduced. In the original draft, she accidentally spilled the champagne because she was trying to avoid the groping hands of her manager. In Gable's edit, she was simply clumsy, a wide-eyed innocent. The most critical change was to the whisper. Edith's version had the magnate saying, "You're fired, clean it up." Gable insisted it become, finally, someone who isn't afraid to make a mess. The Glass Slipper Protocol was released in the spring of 1967 with a cover featuring a gloved hand dropping a champagne flute. It sold modestly at first, until a pivotal review in the Chicago Tribune called it a dangerous daydream for the discontented housewife. Sales tripled in a month. Letters poured in to Gable and Stern, not for Edith, but care of the fictional Alexander Blackwood. Women wrote asking for his advice, confessing their own mundane troubles, seeking rescue. They weren't in love with the story. They were in love with the imbalance of power, the fantasy of being chosen by a man who controlled everything except his own heart. The data was undeniable. Gable had tapped into a specific, profitable vein of yearning. He promptly signed Edith to a 3-book contract, each one a slight variation on the same premise. A humble woman, an accidental encounter with a powerful man, a whispered invitation that bypassed the normal rules of society. By 1972, the Protocol series had sold over 2 million copies. But the true explosion, the moment the blueprint escaped the page and infected the broader culture, came from an unexpected medium: daytime television. In 1974, a young soap opera producer named Cynthia Reed was struggling to save her fledgling show, Avenues of the Heart, from cancellation. She picked up a dog-eared copy of the Glass Slipper Protocol at a bus station. Within a week, she had rewritten a key episode. Her heroine, a waitress named Diane, would trip and spill a plate of food on the show's newly introduced tycoon character, Victor. The scene aired on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the show's switchboard was flooded. Viewer ratings spiked 20%. Network executives took note. The soap opera iteration did something the novel couldn't. It added visuals and sustained tension. Week after week, viewers watched the simmering dynamic between the wealthy Victor and the working-class Diane. The accident became the foundational myth of their relationship, referred back to in almost every episode. It created a shared history, an intimate secret. This was the masterstroke. The accident wasn't just a meet-cute, it was a transfer of power. She had, however clumsily, imposed herself on his perfect world, and his unexpected response, the whisper, was him choosing to surrender a piece of his control. By the late 70s, the trope had metastasized. It was in TV movies, paperback romances, and even advertising. A 1978 perfume ad featured a model in a waitress uniform swooning as a man in a tuxedo leaned in to whisper, the tagline reading, "Chance, Romance, Dior." The fantasy was now being sold directly as a lifestyle product, but the psychological scaffolding holding it up was beginning to crack under its own weight. A 1979 university study of 500 regular romance readers found 60% reported increased dissatisfaction with their real-world relationships, specifically citing a lack of dramatic, transformative encounters. The machine was now self-sustaining, feeding on the discontent it helped create. And in a cramped office in Manhattan in 1981, the next evolution was being engineered, one that would remove the last vestiges of reality and send the blueprint into hyperspace. A former advertising executive named Robert Kincaid was developing a new concept, a cable television channel dedicated entirely to romance-themed content. His pitch deck contained a single, stark market analysis slide. It read, "The audience doesn't want love stories. They want a specific, repeatable emotional algorithm. Identify the algorithm, remove the variables, maximize the yield." Kincaid's channel, Romance Vision, launched in 1983. Its programming was a factory line of accidental romance narratives. The boardroom meeting where the formula document was finalized has become legend in media circles. The document, later leaked, laid out the non-negotiable beats. The female lead must be in a service role, the male lead's power must be economic and social, the accident must be her fault but reveal her authenticity, and the whisper must contain a paradox. It is both a command and an invitation. The final line of the document stated, "The fantasy is not wealth, it is absolution." The powerful man absolves her of her clumsiness, her poverty, her ordinary life, and in doing so grants her worth. Romance Vision was a ratings juggernaut. It created stars and made millions, but it also created something more insidious, a standardized expectation. The algorithm was now being beamed directly into homes 24 hours a day. The research department at Romance Vision began tracking something they called the aspiration gap, measuring the distance between a viewer's reality and the channel's fantasy. Their internal memos, which we have obtained, show a chilling awareness. One from 1985 notes, "The wider the gap, the higher the viewer engagement. Dissatisfaction is our primary product." Then in 1989, the entire industry faced an existential threat, not from critics but from law. A landmark sexual harassment case, Michaels v. Sterling Corporation *, went to trial. The plaintiff, a secretary, argued that her boss's persistent romantic advances, which he claimed were inspired by those charming romance stories, created a hostile work environment. The defense entered into evidence a series of Romance Vision episodes the boss had recorded. Their argument, the culture had normalized this behavior. The court rejected that defense. The boss was found liable. For a few months, networks grew nervous. The formula seemed dangerous in the light of a courtroom. The industry's response wasn't to retreat, it was to adapt. The whisper evolved. It could no longer be overtly commanding. The new model, developed in a series of tense writers' retreats in 1990, was the whispered secret. The powerful man wouldn't command or invite. He would share a piece of confidential information, pulling her into his world not by authority but by conspiracy. "I've been looking for someone I can trust," or "They're all wolves but you're different." The transfer of power was now coded as intimacy. The blueprint had just become more potent, and more defensible. By the mid-90s, the cycle was complete. Life was now imitating art imitating life. The first documented case of a woman deliberately spilling a drink on a wealthy man at a charity event, citing a romance vision plot as inspiration, was reported in a 1996 issue of New York magazine. The phenomenon had escaped the screen. It was now a playbook. And as the internet began to weave itself into daily life, a new generation of architects was about to find the ultimate tool for distribution. They wouldn't need a publishing house or a television network. They just needed an algorithm and a thumbnail. But the man who would bridge the old world and the new, the man who turned the romantic whisper into a click, was not a Hollywood producer. He was a frustrated data scientist from Palo Alto who was about to make one catastrophic miscalculation. Dr. Aris Thorne wasn't looking to revolutionize media. He was trying to build a better ad targeting model for a now-defunct social network called Social Sphere. His specialty was mapping emotional contagion, how feelings spread through digital networks. When his sister Lena told him, through tears, that she'd spent 14 hours watching Billionaire Whisper compilations instead of working on her thesis, his professional curiosity was piqued. He asked her why. Her answer would become the cornerstone of a billion-dollar industry. She said, "It's the only thing that makes my brain quiet. The moment before he whispers, everything stops. I just need to know what he says." Thorne recognized this instantly. It wasn't romance. It was a neurological trigger. The curiosity gap, identified by researcher George Lowenstein decades earlier, wasn't just a marketing trick. It was a cognitive itch. The accidental spill created a problem. The powerful man's unexpected reaction created a mystery. The lean-in and the whisper exploited a profound human bias. We are wired to prioritize unfinished stories, a principle known as the Zeigarnik effect. Thorne realized the entire protocol was a perfectly engineered psychological trap. And on the early internet, traps could be measured, optimized, and scaled infinitely. He quit Social Sphere in 2010. Using his savings, he built a prototype. He called it Narrative Pulse. It was a simple algorithm that scraped story summaries from romance forums and fan sites, isolating for specific structural beats. The accident, the status gap, the silent reaction, the lean-in, the whisper. It then cross-referenced these beats with engagement data, click-through rates, watch time, comment sentiment, from pirated video clips on various platforms. The initial results were stunning. Clips containing the lean-in whisper beat retained viewers 42% longer than those that cut away before the secret was revealed. The algorithm also identified a secondary, more potent variable, the stain. Thorne's data showed that videos where the accident resulted in a visible, lingering mark on the powerful man's clothing, a wine stain on a white shirt, coffee on a suit lapel, outperformed others by an average of 72%. The stain was a visual representation of the transgression, a permanent reminder of the ordinary woman's intrusion into the pristine world of power. It was proof the accident happened. It was a scar, and the whisper the algorithm suggested was the treatment. Armed with this data, Thorne took a meeting with the only venture capitalist he thought might understand, Marcus Krell, a former Hollywood child star turned tech investor who had produced several direct-to-video romance thrillers in the 90s. Thorne presented his findings not as a story analysis, but as a predictive engine for content virality. Krell grasped it immediately. He didn't see a tool for understanding narratives. He saw a tool for manufacturing them. He funded Thorne's company, renamed Vera Flow, with $2.5 million on one condition: they would not sell the software. They would become the studio. Vera Flow launched its first channel in 2012. It didn't produce traditional shows. It produced narrative loops, 60 to 90-second live-action clips, shot cheaply with unknown actors, each one a hyper-concentrated dose of the blueprint: accident, status gap, stain, lean-in. The whisper was always just off microphone. The caption read, "What did he just say?" They uploaded 10 clips a day across 3 channels, each tailored to slightly different demographic data. The algorithm learned in real time. It discovered that a male lead with a slight smirk outperformed a stern expression. It learned that the female lead's gasp was most effective when her eyes were wide, but her mouth was closed. It optimized the exact duration of the pause before the whisper, 1.2 seconds. Within 6 months, Vera Flow's channels had amassed over 3 million subscribers. Their content was being repackaged everywhere. But Thorne noticed a disturbing anomaly in the data. The engagement wasn't peaking during the whisper itself. It was peaking afterwards in the comments section. Users weren't just watching the fantasy, they were weaponizing it. They filled the comments with their own imagined scripts for the whisper. He said, "You just made this party interesting." He said, "That suit cost more than your life. Now you owe me." He said, "Finally, a woman who isn't afraid to get me dirty." The fantasy had become participatory, a crowd-sourced dream, and a significant portion of these user-generated whispers were not romantic. They were dark, possessive, and explicitly transactional. Thorne argued they should moderate these comments. Krell refused. The engagement metrics were astronomical. The comment completion rate, where users scrolled to read other imagined whispers, was near 100%. Krell coined the term the whisper gap. The company's internal mantra became, "Don't close the gap, widen it." Vera Flow began actively seeding the comments with their own provocative, unverified whispers from fake accounts to fuel the fire. They weren't just selling a fantasy anymore. They were running a psychological engagement farm. This is when the first fracture appeared. Not in society, but within Vera Flow itself. Thorne's original research was being used to create what he saw as a toxic feedback loop. Krell saw only the growth curve. Their clash came to a head over a proposed new data point. The algorithm had started recommending that the female leads in their clips exhibit not just clumsiness, but signs of genuine distress, shaking hands, hyperventilation, even silent tears after the accident. The data showed a 15% lift in shares when the woman was visibly ashamed. Thorne argued this crossed a line from fantasy into emotional manipulation that mirrored anxiety disorders. Krell's response was recorded in a leaked email. "The data is the data. If real anxiety sells, that's not our pathology. It's the market's." Thorne lost the fight. The distress variable was incorporated. The clips grew more intense, the power imbalance more severe. The powerful man characters began to be portrayed less as lonely tycoons and more as cold, borderline antagonistic figures. The whisper became even more cryptic, often implying threat rather than romance. "You have no idea what you've started," or "Now you belong to the mess you made." And the audience grew, predominantly young, predominantly female. The comments sections morphed into a bizarre hybrid of support group and self-harm forum. Users would post, "I wish this would happen to me," followed by, "I know it's toxic, but I can't stop watching." The blueprint was now evolving in the wild, divorced from its romantic origins. And in 2014, it jumped species from fiction to reality for the second time in history, but with a crucial digital age twist. A 19-year-old community college student in Ohio named Chloe uploaded a shaky, selfie-style video to a now-forgotten platform called Vibe. In the video, she recounted in tears how she had deliberately spilled her latte on her wealthy, married philosophy professor, hoping for a connection. He had not whispered. He had reported her to the dean for harassment. The video was titled, "I tried the whisper trope and it ruined my life." The video went viral, but not as a cautionary tale. It was ripped, clipped, and re-uploaded across hundreds of channels, including Vera Flow's competitors, with sensationalized titles. Students **XY Coffee Gambit BACKFIRES spectacularly. Thorne watched in horror as the algorithm categorized Chloe's real trauma as a new, high-performing subgenre. Cringe fail meets accidental romance. The real human consequence had become just another variable, a new flavor of engagement. The line between fabricating fantasies and mining real pain had vanished. This was the catalyst. Thorne began secretly collecting data on the downstream effects. He found fan forums where users shared tip sheets for orchestrating real-life accidents, what drinks stain best, how to calculate the value of a man's suit by the label, which public events had the highest concentration of eligible targets. He discovered a burgeoning subculture on image-sharing sites where users would Photoshop themselves into stock images of galas next to suited men, adding text bubbles with imagined whispers. The fantasy was no longer an escape. It was a behavioral script. Armed with this damning internal research, Thorne went to the board in 2015. He presented a 50-page report linking VeraFlow's content strategy to measurable spikes in anxiety and unrealistic relationship expectations in their core demographic, citing third-party studies that dovetailed with his findings. He pleaded for a pivot, for content warnings, for ethical guidelines. Marcus Krell listened, then presented his own slide. It showed VeraFlow's valuation, which had just crossed $400 million. He said, "We're not psychologists, we're mirrors. If the world sees its sickness in our reflection, that's not our fault." The board voted. Thorne was removed from his own company. Devastated and guilt-ridden, Thorne did something reckless. He took his entire research archive, every algorithm, every A/B test result, every internal communication about manipulating user psychology, and sent it to 3 people: a journalist at the Atlantic Asterisk, a researcher at the MIT Media Lab, and a freshman congresswoman from New York who had just proposed a bill on social media accountability for teens. He thought he was triggering a reckoning. Instead, he triggered a gold rush. The journalist wrote a think piece that was widely shared but ultimately faded. The MIT researcher published a dense, academic paper that was ignored by the public. The congresswoman's office, however, saw something else. A young, ambitious legislative aide named Benji Choi read Thorne's research and didn't see an indictment. He saw a blueprint of his own. The data wasn't a warning about manipulation. It was a masterclass in attention capture. Within a year, Choi had left Capitol Hill. He used Thorne's own algorithms, now publicly available in the leaked documents, to found a media consultancy called the Attention Architects. His first clients weren't romance channels, they were political campaigns. And this is where the story twists from a tale of corrupted fantasy into something far more consequential. The accidental romance blueprint, refined by fiction, supercharged by data science, was about to be weaponized not for love, but for power. The whisper wasn't going to be a secret for a waitress's ears only. It was going to be a message for an entire nation. And the man who would deliver it was a real estate mogul turned reality TV star, who already understood the raw, theatrical power of the unexpected confrontation. He just needed someone to teach him how to digitize it, to turn a political rally into a clickable moment of intimate conspiratorial tension. Benji Choi was that someone, and the first lesson began with a simple, devastating principle stolen directly from Aris Thorne's life's work. The stain is proof. The whisper is the promise. Together, they create a bond that reason cannot break. Choi's strategy for Vance was radical. He instructed the candidate to stop giving polished speeches. Instead, at every rally, Vance would create what Choi called a controlled interruption. A pre-selected plant in the audience. A young woman would shout a challenging, often personal question. Vance would pause, appear momentarily flustered, then step away from the podium. He would walk to the edge of the stage, crouch down, and address her directly, his voice dropping, the microphones just barely picking up his tone but not his words. The visual was unmistakable. The powerful man, interrupted and stained by a challenge, leaning in to share a secret with the common person. It was the whisper, scaled for a crowd of thousands. The footage was golden. Clips of these lean-in moments dominated social media, far outperforming any policy speech. The caption was always some variation of, "What did he just say to her?" The comments sections erupted with speculation, just like on the VeraFlow videos. Supporters wrote fan fiction about the secret promise he'd made. Detractors spun conspiracy theories. Engagement metrics went parabolic. Vance, a candidate who had been polling at 12%, won the primary in a landslide. The media called it a miracle of grassroots connection. Choi knew it was a laboratory-perfect application of the narrative pulse algorithm. The blueprint had found its ultimate host. Political communication had always been about storytelling, but now it was about engineering specific, neurologically triggering story asterisk beats. The accident became the gaffe, or the heated exchange. The stain was any visual proof of vulnerability or conflict. The whisper was the candidate's recovery, a calibrated display of intimacy and control that followed. Choi's firm was soon inundated with requests from both sides of the aisle. He refused to work with the Democratic Party, finding their desire for authenticity too nebulous to quantify. He exclusively partnered with candidates who embraced what he called theatrical pragmatism. Then came the 2016 presidential election. Choi was not formally part of the Trump campaign, but his influence was everywhere. The campaign's social media strategy, honed by veterans of reality television, intuitively used every beat of the blueprint. The accidents were the candidates' norm-shattering statements. The stains were the outraged headlines and protests. And the whisper. That was the direct-to-camera Facebook Live videos, the late-night tweets, the sense that the candidate was leaning past the media to speak intimately, conspiratorially to you, the viewer. It was a whisper shouted through a megaphone, but the psychological effect was identical. You are in on the secret. After the election, the attention architects became the most powerful and shadowy consultancy in Washington. Choi didn't just advise on messaging. He advised on timing, staging, and even personnel, selecting staffers and surrogates based on their ability to perform specific roles in the ongoing narrative. The country's political discourse was now being storyboarded using logic derived from a 1967 romance novel. But the real horror wasn't in politics. It was in the spillover. The algorithmic principles perfected by Choi and his imitators didn't stay in the political sphere. They bled, virally, into every facet of digital life. News outlets, desperate for engagement, began structuring their headlines and video segments around the same beats. A diplomatic scandal wasn't just a scandal. It was the moment the ambassador spilled the tea, literally. An economic report became the Fed's shocking whisper to Wall Street. The visual grammar of the lean-in and the hushed tone became the default for explainer videos, tech product reveals, and even corporate apology videos. The entire digital landscape began to resemble an endless, branching, accidental romance narrative, where every interaction was a potential transgression, and every resolution was an intimate secret. This is where the damage became personal and measurable. A 2021 longitudinal study by UCLA tracked 500 young adults' media consumption and relationship health. The findings were stark. Heavy consumers of content that employed the stain and whisper narrative structure showed a significantly higher tendency to interpret real-life conflicts as opportunities for dramatic, romanticized resolution. They were more likely to believe that a healthy relationship required a foundational mess that only their partner could fix. More disturbingly, they exhibited higher tolerance for emotionally inconsistent behavior from partners, interpreting hot and cold treatment as passion rather than instability. The fantasy had inverted. It was no longer an escape from a boring reality. It was a lens that distorted reality into a perpetual, low-grade fantasy, one that was often painful. Social media timelines became highlight reels of manufactured accidents and curated whispers. People began staging their own spills of emotions, of secrets, of drama, hopping to elicit the dramatic, intimate whisper that would validate their existence. The "I'm a mess" confession, followed by the "I can fix you" response, became a dominant courtship script. Authentic, gradual connection was being crowded out by a demand for cinematic intensity. And then, in 2023, the final, logical perversion of the blueprint emerged. A new genre of content exploded on platforms like TikTok and YouTube Shorts. It was called glimmer, or situationship alchemy. Creators, often self-proclaimed coaches, taught viewers how to engineer accidents in their own lives to attract high-status partners. The tutorials were chillingly specific: how to spill your vulnerabilities at the right time, how to create a problem only the target can solve, how to elicit the whisper of commitment. The romantic fantasy had been reverse-engineered into a manual for emotional manipulation. The powerless viewer had been transformed into the active architect of their own trap, using tools sold to them by the very machine that created their loneliness. This was the world Aris Thorne saw from the sidelines, a world he felt responsible for but powerless to change. Vera Flow had been acquired by a massive media conglomerate and folded into their content engine. Marcus Krell was a billionaire living on a private island. The stain had spread far beyond a suit lapel. It had seeped into the fabric of how we relate to power, to story, and to each other. But in a small lab at Stanford in 2023, Thorne, now a visiting scholar, was working on something new. He called it the Antibody Project. If the blueprint was a virus, a replicating pattern of cognitive triggers, could you build an inoculation? His hypothesis was that the power wasn't in the story itself, but in the unresolved gap. What if you taught people to recognize the gap, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a trigger being pulled? He developed a simple browser plugin. It would analyze video content in real time, scanning for the structural beats of the blueprint. When it detected them, the accidental spill, the power differential, the lean-in, it would overlay a subtle, transparent graphic on the screen. A small pulsing icon in the corner with a tooltip. Narrative pattern detected. Curiosity gap engagement. At first, it just identified the pattern. Then he added a feature. When the video paused at the crucial moment before the whisper, the plugin would generate 3 of the most likely banal completions based on a database of thousands of similar clips. He probably said, "We'll get that cleaned up." Statistical likelihood, he asked for a manager. Common trope, he makes a joke about the catering. The effect was immediate and profound. In user testing, the magical tension evaporated. The whisper was demystified. The gap was filled not with a user's personalized fantasy, but with a menu of predictable, unromantic options. Engagement with the content plummeted, but more importantly, users reported a sudden, clear-eyed recognition. One tester wrote, "It feels like waking up from a dream. You realize you were following a dotted line." Thorne published his research openly. He released the plugin for free. For a few weeks, it felt like a revelation. Tech journalists wrote about breaking the spell. But then the counterattack began. The major platforms, whose algorithms were expertly tuned to exploit these very patterns, updated their terms of service. The plugin was flagged as a third-party engagement manipulation tool and blocked. Articles were published questioning Thorne's ethics, suggesting he was spoiling fun and treating audiences like children. Marcus Krell gave a rare interview to a business magazine, dismissing Thorne as a failed entrepreneur suffering from seller's remorse, now trying to philosophize his way back to relevance. Thorne's inoculation was rejected by the body politic. The virus was too entrenched, too profitable. He had proven the disease was treatable, but the patient refused the cure. This is where our story should end, with the resigned acknowledgement that some fantasies are too seductive to dismantle, that some blueprints are now baked into the architecture of our reality. But that's not what happened, because in early 2024, a new data point appeared on Thorne's radar, a tiny, anomalous spike in a dataset he monitored. It wasn't about romance content or political content. It was about a seemingly innocuous new genre, cozy fantasy and soft life videos. These were slow, gentle clips of quiet routines, baking, gardening, reading, the opposite of high-drama spills and whispers. And yet Thorne's legacy algorithms detected a familiar ghost in the machine. The structure was there, but inverted. The accident was a moment of peaceful mistake, a misspelled word in a journal, a cracked pie crust. The whisper was the creator's gentle, forgiving voiceover. The powerful man was absent. The power was now vested in the viewer's own idealized self. The blueprint hadn't been defeated. It had evolved again, shedding its romantic and political skins to become something even more fundamental, a template for self-soothing. The promise was no longer that a powerful other would rescue you. The promise was that you could rescue yourself by curating your own vulnerability and administering your own whisper. The stain was now an aesthetic choice. The gap was now within. This was the moment Aris Thorne finally understood the true scale of what he had helped unleash. It wasn't a story type. It was a cognitive paradigm, a way of processing existence itself through the lens of problem, mystery, and intimate resolution. It could attach itself to anything: love, politics, spirituality, self-care. The question was no longer how to stop it. The question was, what happens to a society that can only understand itself through one endlessly repeating story? When every relationship, every ambition, every moment of peace becomes just another variation of the spill and the whisper. As Thorne stared at the data, a notification pinged on his computer. It was an email from Lena, his sister. The subject line was, "Need to talk." The preview text read, "I think I'm being targeted by one of those glimmer coaches. He's using all the patterns you taught me to look for, but it's different this time. It feels real. What do I do?" The virus had completed its circle. It had left the screen, evolved through politics and self-help, and returned home to hunt the very person who had inspired its discovery. The stain was no longer on a suit. It was on the human heart, and the whisper we were all waiting for was the answer to whether we could ever truly hear anything else. Thorne told his sister to play along, but to record every interaction. Lena's coach, who went by the name Soren, was a 25-year-old using a suite of tools that were directly descended from Vera Flo's models. He had Lena catalog her daily micro-accidents: a missed bus, a spilled coffee, a work email sent to the wrong person, and reframe them as glimmers, opportunities to appear vulnerably charming to a target list of high-net-worth men she followed online. The prescribed next step was to engineer a real-world collision, and then deploy a rehearsed, flustered apology designed to elicit a specific, nurturing response. It was the whisper, broken into a 12-step program. Thorne took the recordings and the methodology and did something unprecedented. He created a public dashboard. On a plain website, he posted Soren's instructions side by side with the original narrative pulse code that predicted their effectiveness. He annotated each step with the psychological principle it exploited and the historical precedent from the glass slipper trope. He didn't expose Soren's real identity. He exposed the pattern. The headline read, "The romance blueprint is now a crime scene. Here is the weapon." The response was volcanic. The site crashed under the traffic. Major news outlets picked up the story, but they missed the point, focusing on the creepy dating coach angle. The real explosion happened in the forums and subcultures where the blueprint had taken root. For the first time, the architects and the targets were looking at the same schematic. Women who had paid thousands for glimmer courses recognized the scripts. Men who had been unwittingly targeted saw the mechanics. A brutal collective disillusionment set in. The magic was gone. The whisper had been transcribed, and it was just a sales pitch. This collective awakening had a tangible effect. Over the next 3 months, the most prominent situationship alchemy coaches saw their patronage drop by an average of 80%. The buzzword glimmer itself became a synonym for manipulation. The market for this particular strain of the fantasy collapsed almost overnight. But Thorne knew this was just one tumor. The metastasis was everywhere. So he took the next, more radical step. He open-sourced everything: the original algorithm, his antibody project code, and his entire research archive. He released it under a single, defiant license called the Truth in Fiction license, requiring any commercial use to include a visible disclaimer about narrative manipulation. The result was a strange, decentralized immune response. A community of developers, writers, and psychologists began building tools. One team created a plugin for script-writing software that flagged blueprint-compliant character dynamics. Another built a social media filter that could warn users when their own posts were mimicking the distress and rescue pattern. A group of novelists launched a tropecraft manifesto, pledging to subvert the accident whisper dynamic in their work. The most impactful tool came from an unexpected quarter, a collective of former reality TV editors. They built a video essay series called Deconstructed, which used Thorne's algorithm to analyze popular films, shows, and political speeches, graphically overlaying the beat structure in real time. Their episode on a famous romantic comedy, showing how the female lead's career-ending mistake was a necessary plot device to make her available for the billionaire's rescue, was viewed over 20 million times. The culture was developing antibodies, but the virus fought back. The media conglomerates that owned the rights to the old RomanceVision library and the modern Vera Flow catalog struck back with lawsuits, claiming copyright infringement and trade secret violation. The legal battle was fierce, but it only served to publicize Thorne's cause further. In a pivotal court hearing, Thorne's lawyer argued they weren't stealing stories. They were analyzing a public health crisis. The judge, in a surprising ruling, allowed the Deconstructed series to continue under fair use, drawing a distinction between critiquing a cultural pattern and pirating a specific plot. This ruling created a fragile safe space for criticism, but the real, enduring change happened at the individual level, in thousands of small, quiet moments of recognition. People began to see the blueprint in their own lives, in the boss who created a crisis only he could solve, in the partner who demanded forgiveness for dramatic betrayals, in their own craving for a storybook twist to solve mundane problems. The fantasy didn't disappear, but its power diminished. It became a recognizable genre, not a template for living. And then, in the autumn of 2024, the final, surprising evolution occurred. A new generation of creators, raised on the deconstruction, began to rebuild. They started making content that played with the blueprint explicitly, with irony and consent. A popular web series called The Spill Department followed a team of professional cleaners who specialized in undoing the messes of meet cutes, offering wry commentary on the entitled clients. Romance novels began appearing with tags like no power imbalance and whisper free. The most interesting development was in the realm of interactive fiction. A game designer created a text-based adventure where you play as the billionaire. The accident happens in the first scene. The rest of the game is about managing the logistics, the dry cleaning bill, the HR investigation, and your own social anxiety. It was a hit. The fantasy, when viewed from the other side, became a comedy of errors. The blueprint had been defanged not by elimination but by comprehension and play. It was no longer a hidden script running the system. It was a known quantity, a tool in the box, one narrative option among many. The stain was just a stain. The whisper was just a sentence. Aris Thorne now works as a consultant for a nonprofit that teaches digital literacy through narrative analysis. His sister Lena is completing her PhD in cognitive psychology, studying how communal story breaking can improve mental health outcomes. Marcus Krell's media empire continues, but its once ubiquitous Loop channels have been rebranded and diluted, now just a small part of a vast content ocean. The political strategists still use the tools of tension and resolution, but a more skeptical public is quicker to recognize the staging. We end not with an explosion, but with a slow, steady reclamation. The story that began with a spilled drink at a gala was never about love or power. It was about a fundamental human craving for narrative order, problem, mystery, resolution. The danger wasn't the story itself. It was the monopoly. When one story becomes the only story, it ceases to be a fantasy and becomes a cage. The final, surprising detail comes from a warehouse in Nevada. A film memorabilia collector recently acquired the contents of a storage unit that once belonged to Lionel Gable, the publisher who bought The Glass Slipper Protocol. Among the boxes of old ledgers and contracts was a single, handwritten page. It was Edith Wharton's original submission letter, the one with the line Gable found so compelling. But the collector noticed something the publisher had missed. Edith's original typed line read, "This is a fantasy for women who feel invisible." But in the margin, in Edith's own handwriting, she had scribbled a later edition, then crossed it out so heavily it was almost illegible. Using spectral imaging, the collector revealed the words she tried to erase. They read, "Because I am one of them, and it is a prison." The woman who engineered the fantasy knew it was a prison from the start. The blueprint contained its own escape hatch, the critical, crossed-out truth of its own invention. The real whisper, the one we spent 60 years leaning in to hear, was never the secret promise of the powerful man. It was the silenced confession of the woman who built the cage, trying to tell us it was locked from the inside. And the key was always in the margin. Edith's crossed-out confession is the true ending of her story, and the beginning of ours. The prison she described wasn't built of stone, but of story. And we have all been both its inmates and, at times, its unwitting architects, passing down the blueprint through every like, every share, every time we crave a narrative that promises resolution through intimacy rather than through the hard, unglamorous work of equality. The spill, the stain, the whisper, these are more than tropes. They are cognitive landmarks in a psychological territory we've been taught to navigate as the only route to connection and worth. But as we've seen, once you map the territory, you can choose different paths. You can build different stories. The question that lingers isn't whether these narratives will disappear. They won't. The human brain loves pattern, problem, and solution. The real question is whether we can cultivate what Aris Thorne called narrative literacy, the ability to read the blueprint even as we're being drawn into the house, to feel the thrill of the whisper while understanding the mechanics of the lean-in, to enjoy the fantasy without mistaking it for an instruction manual for our lives, our politics, or our hearts. The most subversive act left to us is not to stop telling stories, but to become conscious, critical, and creative storytellers of our own realities. To build connections that don't require an accident to spark them. To value interactions that aren't about one person absolving another's mess, but about mutual respect that exists without the prerequisite of a stain. To understand that the most powerful whisper is often the one that says, "I see you," without needing you to be clumsy, broken, or in need of rescue first. This documentary is one map, but the territory is vast and constantly shifting, from the novels on your shelf to the algorithms on your screen. If you want to keep exploring how the hidden stories around us shape everything from what we buy to how we vote and who we love, then help us build this channel into a resource. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Your engagement tells the platform that this kind of deep dive matters, that understanding the machinery of our culture is as vital as being entertained by it. Because the story never really ends, it just evolves, and the next chapter is yours to write. Thank you for watching.